Way back in the 1980s, the genre of science fiction underwent a radical change thanks to two seminal works of fiction. In 1982, Ridley Scott's Blade Runner brought cyberpunk into the mainstream. Adapted from Philip K. Dick's 1986 novel Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, with its mix of dystopian cityscapes, hard-boiled noir, and gritty aesthetic, it would set the tone for the cyberpunk aesthetic as we know it today. In the written world, William Gibson's Neuromancer was a world of rogue hackers, console cowboys they were called, living through their console decks in the virtual world of the Matrix. The worlds of Blade Runner and Neuromancer came right around the same time. In fact, they look pretty similar if you think about it on the surface level. As it turns out, according to an interview with Ridley Scott, that was just a funny coincidence. Both Gibson and Ridley were inspired by 1970s New Wave French-style comics and a heavy influence of Japanese urban development. We know what cyberpunk looks like. The aesthetics and philosophy can be seen all across media since the 1980s, with films like Ghost in the Shell, Akira, The Fifth Element, and more recently the upcoming Cyberpunk 2077 game. We see a repeating pattern of mega-corporations, vast income inequality, the idea of self-worth and identity in many cyberpunk worlds, all to those backdrops of giant, holographic advertisements larger than life to the point of being propaganda. In the 1980s and 90s, the cyberpunk genre exploded onto the scene with the works I had mentioned earlier. One massive success would spawn more works and would follow a similar trend. As an example, in the written world, Gibson's Neuromancer inspired Neil Stephenson's book Snow Crash. Having heavy ties to the detective noir genre, other works would have protagonists like Blade Runner's Deckard, such as Altered Carbon's Elias Riker. This was not isolated to the West, as Japan had an explosive cyberpunk influence in media. Akira would actually go on to influence Aelita Battle Angel, which is getting an American adaptation which, fingers crossed, is not actual garbage this time. Blade Runner's cultural relevance would influence Ghost in the Shell, which would then go back to influence the Wachowskis when making The Matrix. Cyberpunk for the longest time was seen as a harsh critique of corporate culture during its time. Writers and storytellers were pushing the boundaries for what could be said, but like all things new, soon it became kind of normal, and the marketplace became oversaturated in a sense. Bruce Bethke, the writer who coined the phrase cyberpunk from his 1983 short story of the same name, commented on the popularity of the genre, saying, "It went from something unexpected, fresh, and original, to being a trendy fashion statement, to being the flavor of the month, to being a repeatable commercial formula. It became a hoary trope." Looking at the genre from the perspective of an outsider, the genre can appear to be a series of checklists and must-haves rather than an expressive movement. Flying cars? Check. Gritty and dense urban cities? Check. Megacorporations and technobabble about our individuality and personhood and oppressive techno-oligopoly? Check, check, and check. Cyberpunk was born at a time of authoritarian governments and rampant capitalism, as demonstrated by the larger-than-life advertisements mirroring the advertisement strategies of the 1980s. It criticized many aspects that mirrored our culture at the time, such as the war on drugs, the sexual revolution that was going on at the time, and other significant events that became a paradigm shift in our culture. One of which was vast income inequality, where corporations grew to monolithic, oppressive pseudo-governments, all while the middle class and poor were pushed further and further down. It's something that we are seeing today with greater and greater corporate consolidation. Writers of cyberpunk took these elements along with early hacker culture and the emergence of the punk counterculture movement to make a dystopian world in a not-so-distant future, which shows us what might happen if our lives become too reliant on technology and money. However, as time went on, the genre became less and less avant-garde, and as quickly as it came onto the scene, it became more commonplace. However, in the early 2010s, a new movement would begin to form and mirror the philosophy of cyberpunk. But rather than manifest itself in movies or books or even video games, this movement would come largely as a movement of aesthetics and music. It is largely underground, but perhaps most internet-savvy people would recognize this song. derived from Diana Ross's It's Your Move, Macintosh Plus and similar artists helped make a music genre derived from plunderphonics, a music subgenre made by sampling, remixing, and editing other people's work, and which quickly grew into perhaps one of the most well-known underground music genres today, Vaporwave. Now sprawled out in its own subculture, the tenets of Vaporwave mirror those of Cyberpunk mainly as a critique of rampant capitalism and consumerism that plagued the 90s and 80s. However, unlike Cyberpunk, Vaporwave looks to the past from a modern perspective. Where Cyberpunk literature gave us a grim and dystopian look into the near future, ravaged by technology and megacorporations, Vaporwave recontextualized the era a lot of us grew up in, and paints a dystopian past we lived through. It is, in a sense, weaponized nostalgia. How it does this is through a phenomenon between timbre, the actual sound of the music, and the emotional response we get from said music. There have been many studies that have shown a link between memory, emotion, and instrumental timbre. Laura Glitzos better defines this phenomenon in her article, Vaporwave, or Music Optimized for Abandoned Malls. That is, that this subgenre of music makes the listener draw upon their own repository of past experiences, but only in order to plug into the collective and complex reproduction of memory as a form of play. To put it simply, Vaporwave is a genre that takes from a collective hive mind of its participants to create a sort of memory bank of shared past experiences. We, as a collective, largely remember old commercial jingles from yesterdecade or spending an inappropriate amount of time at the mall and video arcades. These are just some of the things that, while dying in our current culture, are still kept alive in the shared collective of the Vaporwave community, only distorted and recontextualized to show a more dystopian view of the past that never could truly be, but is remembered now by people who lived through it. The tenets of Cyberpunk can be seen in Vaporwave, but with a fresh new direction that could help reinvigorate the genre and perhaps create a symbiotic relationship. Cyberpunk was always concerned with the future, or near future, often with the telltale sign of what is to come. But Vaporwave tells us we are already living in that very same future today. Of course, the fixation on consumerism and capitalism are not the only points both Vaporwave and Cyberpunk share. A large staple of both genres is modern Japanese cityscapes, writing, and other aspects of downtown Tokyo, the urban Japanese metropolis. This kind of imagery is evoked in Neuromancer, where the story begins in a dystopian Chiba City, Japan. According to Gibson, Japan was simply cyberpunk, and Vaporwave certainly borrows a lot from Japan and many other facets of the culture, so much so that people may have claimed it to be cultural appropriation. But is that by design? What was the reason for that? To better answer this question, we'll need to take a short history lesson. But to make a long story short, this takes place back in post-World War II Japan. The country found itself in a unique position during its reconstruction. In the 1970s and 80s, Japan would find themselves in what could only be described as a post-war economic miracle, where productions and companies were producing products and boosting the Japanese economy to preposterous levels. At the same time, the culture of Japan was heavily influenced by American pop culture, who was going through a disco and funk revolution in music at the same time. Soon, music imitating this style would emerge, and the genre of city pop was born. Now, city pop is a genre that deserves its own video, but to highlight some of the elements of city pop, it was a genre that promoted a lavish lifestyle, that were brimming with optimism for the future and high life in general. Eventually, as the post-war economic miracle began to decline, Japan slipped into a recession, and city pop as a genre became a thing of the past, oversaturated now, with so many acts and bands and musical styles. It is now a dead genre. There are a few places that you can stream city pop music today, but one of the most main resurgence of the genre has been in the samples of Vaporwave music, where the cheery vocals are slowed down and remixed to lament what was at one point, in Japanese culture, rife with consumerism and a booming economy. However, I would argue that the next place for Vaporwave to go is Cyberpunk. Many people in the genre can already point to a few notable examples of Cyberpunk-influenced Vaporwave music. One of the most famous examples will be 2814's Birth of a New Day, an ambient cyberpunk album that evokes the dystopian void of a bustling downtown cityscape. While Vaporwave may not share the hard-boiled detective-driven narratives that most cyberpunk novels follow, I think the tenets of Vaporwave, as a subculture, facilitate a transition from music and aesthetics to literature, and create something that might be called Vaporfic in the future. But what would Vaporfic look like? There have been some movements that have begun to facilitate this. Private Suite is a Vaporwave-focused magazine that started in early 2018 and has begun to include a few pieces of Vaporfic. And while these entries could really be described more as stream-of-consciousness poems, I think the potential for full-length, short story, and plot-driven narrative using the Vaporwave tenets and tone is possible. In fact, in just this past year, there are 2 novels that stand out as examples of Vaporfic. The first is The Void, by Aisha Lang. The Void tells the story of a group of teenagers suffering from different mental disorders, but all find themselves in a strange, otherworldly place that can only really be described as the Void. The second is No Joy, by H. William Davis, that takes a more experimental side of fiction and Vaporwave influences. I'll be doing a deeper dive into these 2 novels in the future, but for now, Vaporfic is still a very new concept that would be explored in the world of cyberpunk or even larger science fiction. As the Vaporwave subculture grows, despite the ever-present motto Vaporwave is dead, its evolution will inevitably include the written word. The only question left remaining for now is how. Well, this is the first work of 2019. I know it's been a while since I've uploaded anything, but this has really been in the pipeline for a good long while. You can always like these videos. You can leave a like. If you have any other comments or concerns, you can leave them down in the comment section below. You can always support me on this channel through Patreon, or if you don't feel like using Patreon, I also have a Ko-Fi account. Ko-Fi? Coffee. I think it's supposed to be coffee. Anyway, these are unscripted outros, and you can probably tell that they are, so I'm just going to stop before it becomes any more awkward.